Hello, my family. Welcome back to another adoption episode. If they finally showed up, what would you do differently? Don't answer that yet. I didn't, and I still don't know how. Before we unfold this question, before we try to make it useful or reasonable or turn it into something that makes sense, I want to stay right here for a moment. Because this question didn't come from therapy or reflection or some big emotional breakthrough. It showed up quietly, and it caught me off guard. Before we go there, quick pause. If you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do that. Like the episode if these conversations land for you. And if you're listening from somewhere else, another country, another city, tell me where you're hearing this from. I actually want to know where these moments are landing. Okay, now let me tell you what I saw this weekend. It was Christmas Day, but not in the loud, chaotic way people usually mean when they say that. No rushing, no big production. Just one of those slow days where the hours stretch out and conversations come in pieces. I was on the phone with my daughter, listening to her talk about her Christmas, what she did, where she went, the little details you collect because they matter to you, even if you don't say that out loud. I remember smiling, asking questions, letting her talk. Nothing heavy, nothing dramatic, just listening. Then the phone calls shifted. Friends, one after another. Different voices, same undertone. People talking about their holidays, but circling the same thing without naming it. Who didn't come, who stayed home. Who said they might stop by and never did. Houses that were quieter than planned. Meals that felt unfinished. No one was crying. No one was making a big deal out of it. It was said casually, almost defensively, like it was normal enough not to deserve attention. I kept listening. I'd respond the way I always do. The right pauses, the right words. The kind of responses that let people talk without feeling exposed. I could hear myself doing it, almost automatically. And the thing is, none of the stories shocked me. They stacked up quietly, one after another, like background noise you don't notice until it stops. Christmas kept moving along. Music in the background, conversations drifting in and out. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, I felt this stillness settle in. Not sadness, not anger, just awareness. Something was forming, but I didn't touch it yet. As the day went on, the repetition became harder to ignore. Different people. Different lives, different families, same outcome. No one came. No one followed through. No one showed up the way they said they would. What stood out wasn't the absence itself. It was how unsurprising it felt. How no one seemed confused by it. How easily the conversation moved past it, like this was just part of the holiday script. I noticed my own reaction next. There was no tightening in my chest. No spike of emotion. No urge to fix anything. I wasn't even disappointed on their behalf. I recognized it, not intellectually, physically. Like my body already knew this shape, like it had seen this scene enough times to stop reacting to it. I realized I wasn't waiting for a different ending. I was listening the way you listen to something familiar. Predictable, expected, and that's when it felt strange. Not what they were saying, but how natural it all felt to me. I stayed quiet longer than usual, let people talk, let the stories land where they landed. And underneath the conversations, there was this unspoken recognition that I hadn't planned to have that day. This wasn't an exception. This wasn't bad luck. This was a pattern I knew well enough that it didn't even register as a problem anymore. And that realization didn't come with answers. It just stayed there. It was later in the day when I finally noticed myself, not in a mirror kind of way, more like catching your reflection in a dark window when you weren't trying to look. I was still moving through the day, answering messages, listening, responding, but something felt slightly off. I wasn't reacting the way I thought I should. People were talking about disappointment, about quiet houses, about plans that didn't happen. And while I understood what they were saying, I wasn't emotionally meeting them there. There was no shock rising up, no sadness blooming, no urge to reassure myself that next year would be different. Instead, there was this calm familiarity, almost neutrality. That's what caught my attention, because this wasn't me being detached or cold. It was me recognizing something my body already knew, like I'd stepped into a room I'd been in before and instinctively knew where the light switch was. I didn't interrupt myself. I didn't force a feeling. I just let it sit there. And the more I noticed it, the clearer it became. This wasn't new information. I'd heard these stories before. I'd lived versions of them. I'd organized my expectations around this exact outcome so many times that it no longer registered as a disruption. That realization didn't feel dramatic. It felt accurate. The question didn't come in loud. It slipped in quietly, between conversations while the day kept moving. Why am I expecting people to be something unknown that has never actually been part of my life? Not once, not consistently, not even from the people closest to me. I wasn't angry when I thought it. I wasn't accusing anyone. I was just taking inventory. I ran through the timeline in my head, not to blame, not to relive, but to check the facts. And the facts were simple. People haven't shown up for me the way I've imagined they would. Not in the way that feels steady. Not in the way that arrives without conditions. Not in the way that stays. And yet I've been holding space for that arrival anyway. That's what didn't make sense anymore. The expectation didn't match the road I'd actually walked. It didn't come from experience. It didn't come from memory. It didn't come from something I could point to and say, this is how it's always been. It came from somewhere else. And once I noticed that, I couldn't pretend I hadn't. That's when it landed. I've never learned what it feels like to receive that kind of showing up. Not because I wasn't worthy of it, not because I didn't want it, but because it simply wasn't there. You can't expect what you've never known. You can't receive what you were never taught how to hold. And suddenly the expectation itself felt strange, like a language I'd been speaking fluently without ever being immersed in the culture. I realized something else then, too. This expectation didn't come from my life. It came from stories. From watching families on television drop everything and rush across town. From movies where people arrive at the last second. From cultural scripts that say someone will come for you, even when no one ever has. I'd absorbed it without realizing it, carried it quietly, let it shape how I waited, how I hoped, how I stayed open long past what made sense. And sitting there on Christmas Day, with the phone calls behind me and the house still, I could finally see the gap between what I'd lived and what I'd been expecting. Not with judgment, just clarity. Somewhere in the middle of that day, without warning, it took me back. Not in a dramatic way, not like a flashback you see on TV. More like that quiet slide your mind does when it recognizes a feeling before it recognizes the memory attached to it. It took me back to being a kid, to that house, to that family, to the moment I knew I was adopted and believed, without even questioning it, that this was where everything would finally change. I remember thinking that now that I had a family, things would look different, feel different, that there would be this shift I could relax into, that I'd get the scene I'd been promised without realizing anyone had promised it to me. The big family, the full table, people showing up because they wanted to, not because they were supposed to. I kept waiting for the moment where I could finally let my guard down, where I could stop watching people so closely, where I could trust without calculating, where love didn't feel like something you managed. And I waited the way kids wait, quietly, hopefully, patiently, believing that if I stayed good, stayed grateful, stayed easy, it would eventually arrive. Maybe this is where someone says I sound like an ungrateful adoptee. I've heard that before. But this wasn't about gratitude. It was about expectation. I kept drawing from that well, waiting for reassurance, for closeness, for that unspoken "I've got you," and I didn't realize how dry it was until much later. Not because no one cared, but because I kept expecting something no one had ever actually shown me how to receive. Here's the part people like to say out loud, usually with a shrug. You can't believe what you see on TV. And sure, that's easy to say once you already know what real connection feels like, once you've lived it, once you've been met. But those stories didn't come from nowhere. The people who wrote them, directed them, acted them out, they weren't inventing a language from scratch. They were portraying something that existed somewhere, for someone. And when you grow up without that experience, you borrow the script. You learn what love is supposed to look like by watching it. You learn what showing up means by seeing it dramatized. You learn what family feels like through scenes, not memory. So when real life doesn't match that script, you don't immediately blame the script. You blame yourself. You think you're doing it wrong. You think you're asking too much. You think you just haven't earned the ending yet. And the cruel irony is this. When something different does show up, something unfamiliar, something quieter, something that doesn't look like the movie version, you don't recognize it as love. You don't know what to do with it, because you were waiting for fireworks, for proof, for the scene where everyone finally arrives. So you keep waiting, you keep hoping, you keep expecting something you don't actually know how to hold. And that's the part no one tells you. It's not just that people don't show up. It's that when they do, sometimes you don't know how to receive it. And that realization sat with me long after the day ended. This is the part that's harder to sit with. Because what if the problem was never that I expected too much? What if the problem was that I was never allowed to live out loud as who I actually was? I started to see it differently, not as disappointment, not as hope gone wrong, but as something quieter and heavier. Every time I showed up as myself, every time I didn't smooth the edges enough, every time I didn't play the part the way it was expected, something in the room shifted. Not because I was wrong, because I was real, and real has a cost. Growing up adopted, pushed around by circumstance, moved into systems that needed to believe in themselves, I wasn't carrying a fantasy. I was carrying evidence. Evidence that things break, that families fracture, that love isn't always neat, that belonging doesn't arrive wrapped and certain. And that kind of truth makes people uncomfortable. So you learn quickly what happens when you don't protect the illusion. You learn what happens when you exist without translating yourself first. You learn that honesty doesn't always get met with understanding. It often gets met with distance. That's what rejection really felt like. Not punishment, correction, a quiet message that said, don't tell that story. Don't stand there like that. Don't remind us of what we don't want to look at. So I learned how to soften, how to perform, how to keep the truth folded just enough that everyone else could stay comfortable. And every rejection along the way wasn't proof that I didn't belong. It was proof that I was carrying something the room couldn't hold. That realization didn't fix anything, but it clarified everything. So I'll leave you with the question, not because I don't care to answer it, but because answering it too quickly would miss the point. If they finally showed up, what would you do differently? I'm not going to resolve that here. I'm not going to turn it into advice or closure or a neat takeaway, because this isn't about fixing expectations, and it's not about lowering them. It's about understanding why that question exists at all. And here's the part I want you to sit with. You are not the problem. You were never the problem. You are not unwanted in the way you were taught to believe. You are not extra. You are not leftover. You are not evidence of something gone wrong. If anything, you are most needed. Needed because you carry what's real. Needed because you remember what others learned to edit out. Needed because truth doesn't survive without someone willing to hold it. That doesn't mean it's easy, and it doesn't mean it hasn't cost you. But it does mean that rejection was never proof of your unworthiness. It was proof of how disruptive truth can be in a world invested in performance. I'll unpack more about truth versus performance in the next episode, because that deserves its own space. For now, just sit with the question. And if you want, write your answer below. Share what came up for you. Read someone else's response. You're not alone in this, even if it's felt that way. That's where this episode ends.